I'm speaking to my people, and you know that feeling when you catch a wave or you go for a run, and just for a moment, maybe even a little bit longer for that moment, everything sort of disappears. Your nervous system settles, your mind goes quiet, and you're completely fully there, which we know is referred to as flow state. So our guest today has spent his entire career figuring out exactly what happens in those moments and how we use them to help heal. And Josh, I love this so much. It's so unique in the sector. Josh Dickson is an accredited EMDR consultant, founder of Resurface UK, and the creator of the Resurface Method, a groundbreaking approach that combines EMDR therapy with surf therapy to support trauma and grief resolution at a level most traditional approaches simply cannot reach. He holds a Master of Science in EMDR therapy, brings over a decade of experience in trauma, and he consults on clinical programs for organizations worldwide. Research from Harvard and the University of Sydney backs what we in this community have felt in the water. Flow state enhances problem solving. This is one of my favorite parts, Josh. Creativity and learning. So, Josh, the science, it's been built and everything seems to be proven that it's working. I cannot look forward to this even further. So I'm going to let you go. Welcome our friend, our colleague, Josh Dickson. Thank you for being here, everybody.
Thank you. And thank you for giving me this opportunity, Chris. And thank you all for being here. So what I want to do today is I want to break this down into three sections. I just want to talk about what is flow, or what are flow states, how do we get into flow, and then to really go to do a deep dive into what we call the flow cycle. But I also want to give you the opportunity to ask questions and hopefully you will have questions because my favorite part of any of these kind of things is asking questions and going a little deeper. But just curious, if you could just put your hand up or make an virtually or with your hand up, if you know what flow states are. I know Chris just mentioned it just now, but just if you do know what flow states are. Okay, so we've got some people who do and some people who don't. Okay, great. There are easy ways of describing flow and there are technical ways, but flow is basically a state of consciousness where you feel your best and you perform at your best. There are words that have been used to describe flow states before flow was prescribed, before that was the word that people decided to agree on. Um, Athletes talk about being in the zone where everything is just coming together. Artists talk about being in flow. Musicians talk about being in the pocket. And they're all describing exactly the same process. And this is a process where time kind of dilates. It seems to stand still or it seems to go very, very fast, but you lose that conception of time. You're completely at one with what you're doing. Everything seems to make sense when you're in that state. Um, it feels it's extraordinary. It feels amazing and yet there's no feeling at the same time. I think some of you can would understand what I mean by that is when you're surfing a wave and it's all just coming together, you don't really feel anything. You're so in it that you don't feel anything. But as soon as it finishes, you feel amazing. So we've got that time dilation, we've got that complete absorption in the moment. Some people would describe it as a deeply spiritual feeling, and we're going to get into why that's the case later. But basically, it is this. Stephen Kotler defines it as optimal form of consciousness, where you feel your best and perform at your best. And I think that's the easiest and simplest way to go forward with this. So flow, and if you are wondering, like, have I ever been in a flow state? Just take yourself back to being a kid. Kids are the best at being in flow, and that's often how they do most of their learning in the first 6 years of their lives is in constant flow state. And you'll see that a lot of educational systems, particularly Montessori education, but other kindergarten education, set up the whole environment for kids to be in flow, and that explains a lot of the accelerated learning that's at play there. But being in the zone, being in the pocket if you're playing music, being in flow if you're dancing or a musician. The extraordinary thing about flow states is they feel the same regardless of the activity you're doing. And this is something that blew my mind when I suddenly realized this is I used to be a professional musician and I used to get into flow state playing with other people when I was a kid, kind of in orchestra and then in bands later on. And then I used to be a skater. And then when I started surfing later in my life, I was like, this feels the same. I'm getting the same states here. And when I started to learn about this, the science of flow, it started to make sense. And the belief is that flow states evolved from runner's high, that runner's high was the first kind of flow state, and it gave us that evolutionary advantage to stay in the zone, fully focused and just be in the moment for a long time without really realizing what's going on outside of you. And so flow states, I hope you're understanding what they are, not what you are. And I hope you have a sense of that you've seen either in other people or in yourselves. I mean, in the West, we pay billions of dollars a year to watch people in flow playing sports. We love watching other people in flow. We love watching people in flow states when they're creating things artistically. I mean, just look at the phenomenon of TikTok dance. People like watching people just really in the zone with what they're doing. And yes, that's great. But what are the advantages of flow and how can flow states help enhance, or where's the value in flow states when it comes to therapeutic healing? And hopefully that's by the end of this, you'll get a real sense of that. But what are some of the advantages of being in flow? Well, first of all, and Chris mentioned this a bit at the beginning, is um, Harvard found there's a famous study, and I've put some PDFs in the chat, by the way, that have references. And if you want to have a bit of a more of a deep dive into this, those PDFs are there. But Harvard discovered enhanced creativity of up to 3 days following being in flow once. McKinsey found a 500% increase, up to a 500% increase in productivity following being in flow state. DARPA found something like 430% increase in problem solving, and University of Sydney have found similar things. And there's plenty of other studies that can point to that. But if you just take those three or four things I've just said there, that's pretty incredible. Up to 500% productivity gains, but also enhancements in problem solving and creativity. Well, what is it that we're hoping that people are going to be able to do, reflecting in maybe introspecting on their own lives or trying to help other people with their lives in the behavioral health sector, for example, which surf therapy fits in, is can we take those productivity gains, those creativity gains, those problem solving gains, and allow people to use that when they are trying to make changes in their own lives? And the answer to that is yes. That's what we're seeing countless times. And you are probably all seeing it in your work. You might you might have exactly the same language as I'm using here and know exactly what I'm talking about. Or some of you might be like where I was 10 years ago, just like, oh wow, he's describing exactly what I've seen and known, but now I know this is a real thing. I know that there's a science behind this. I know there's data behind this, and I found that really like it was really motivating for me when I discovered uh, the real science behind of all of this. So that's what flow states are and the benefits of flow. But okay, I've spoken about flow, and there are these tremendous psychological and physical benefits from being in flow. How how do we get into flow? Because most people, if you talk to them, if they even know what you're talking about, and if you describe it a bit, they go, "Oh yeah, I know that thing. Yeah, I used to do that when I rode horses, or I used to know that state when I was dancing, or I know that state from skateboarding, or from climbing, or from parachuting, whatever it is." You can get in, by the way, you can get into flow states, the same kind of flow states with deep academic activities. Mathematicians will report getting into deep flow state when they're just totally engaged with what they're doing. But most people will say, well, it just kind of comes and goes. Sometimes I get into flow, sometimes I don't. I don't, is it random? Is there a way I can improve this? Like, well, can you tell me a bit about it? Because it just seems a bit kind of, there seems to be an element of luck. And the Flow Research Collective, and I've got a huge amount of value. I trained with them just before COVID. They have identified over 20 flow triggers, and what they mean is ways of getting into flow. But there are basically four that if you could take from today, this would really, like, I think, deepen your knowledge and allow you to begin to get more flow in your life if that's what you're looking for. Now, the first one is to get into flow, we need to have clear goals. We need to know what it is that we are doing. And the reason for that is that flow follows focus, and goals set the focus for us. So if we take surfing, because this is a context where that makes sense, the goal is what? Well, for some people, the goal is just to try and have fun in the waves. For some people, it's to try and get my knees on the board. For some people, it's I'm going to try and stand up. For some people, I'm going to try going a little bit right today. For some people, it's I'm going to try going a little bit left today. And you get these progressions. But if we can encourage people to have a specific, clear goal for the day, that will help people get into flow state because it's focusing the mind. And flow is really super intense focus on the task at hand. That is one of the things it is. So setting a clear goal is absolutely essential. Probably the most important trigger to understand of getting into flow state is understanding something called the skills challenge balance. Now, I've put this in the PDF, so if you want to do a deeper dive, you can with all of this. But the skills challenge balance is basically says that for me to get into flow state, the activity at hand, the thing that I'm trying to do, the challenge has to meet my skill set. And actually, the data shows that up to get into peak flow state, maybe about 4% beyond my skill set, just above, which I can reach to if I really try. If it's 20% above, no chance. But I'll give you an example because I think this makes it when we concretize what we're talking about, or when I concretize what I'm talking about, I think people understand much better. The challenge balance is that if I, so recently with my surfing, I am now kind of quite comfortable in overhead height waves, just over, not double, no chance, but a bit above now. That's where the challenge meets me perfectly. A few years ago, it was lower, and a few years if you put me out in those kind of waves when I was a beginner, I'd have a panic attack. I wouldn't know what to do. For me to fully focus, I need to have adrenaline. I need to have a certain amount of anxiety because anxiety is fantastic emotion for focusing. And so I need to be in conditions that will challenge me enough and I can match those challenges. So if I rewind a little bit and think about, I have 5-year-old twin daughters and they quite like kicking a football around in the garden. It's very unlikely that I'm ever going to get into flow state playing football with my girls in the garden. It's going to be cute. It's going to be sweet. It's going to be fun for a bit. And then it will probably get a little bit boring for me. And I will have to try hard and look at the other ways of enjoying this with them. But in terms of the actual task at hand, my skill set is way too high for playing with my 5-year-old daughters when it comes to football. So it will be calming, relaxing, and then maybe becomes a little bit boring. And then we will change the game up to make it more fun, or I will stop thinking about myself in that moment and I will put the attention on them and so on. Now, I used to play football at university. I had a team at university. I was a very kind of average football player, soccer for our American cousins here. And so I would play with people of my own ability, and that would be the place that I would get into flow playing football. If I found myself for some weird reason on the football pitch at a Premiership game, I would have a panic attack because I am not nearly good enough. It'd be completely out of my league. So I need to be just in that sweet spot between the difficulty and that I can match that. And if you understand that and you know about the skills challenge balance, you can adjust parameters to make that fit for you. So, for example, I see a lot of surf instructors out there with groups of beginners, and for them to get, and they're in very gentle whitewater waves or very small waves as they're teaching people to surf, the sort of thing they will do to get themselves into flow is they'll do a handstand or they'll do some kind of flip, or they will make it harder for themselves to get themselves in the zone for a bit. And so that's a sort of example I see of other people changing the skills balance ratio so that they can get themselves in there. Now, for example, if I'm going out surfing with a group and it's very, very small, tiny conditions, what I will do is I might change the goal. I might say instead of the usual goal for me is 10 good waves in a session. I might say, okay, I'm going to get 25 little waves and I'm going to work out how I can do that. Or I'm going to ride switch, or I'm going to do all sorts of things to try and raise that challenge. And then I find myself getting in the zone. And if it's too hard, I will back off and set new goals that are more manageable for me. And that is probably the most important trigger and understanding of how we can get into flow state is, and knowing that will help you as clinicians, as facilitators, of how I can help the people I'm working with and manage that by really understanding them and understanding where their head is at in terms of what they feel okay with, what's pushing them, and maybe what's too easy for them. So having that awareness of the skills challenge balance isn't just about myself, it's about the people I'm with and the people I'm working with. And I think that's the most important. If you were going to take one thing from today, that'd be the one that I would hope you took above the rest. Now, the other I believe, two most important triggers for getting into flow state is one of the most important things is something we call immediate feedback. To remain in a flow state, you need to be constantly getting feedback that the thing that I'm doing is working and going well. And that's quite easy with surfing because either I'm standing or I'm falling. I'm catching waves or I'm not catching them. The feedback is there all the time. Getting feedback, immediate feedback, say if you're a great writer, is much harder. You have to be seeing it yourself with what you're writing. You're not getting the feedback, say, from an audience or something like that. But when it comes to surfing, the immediate feedback is there all the time. You know that this is going well or not well. You know whether you're going towards your goals or away from your goals because it's very physical and it's very obvious and it's very in the moment. Now, I'm just curious if anyone, this just has come to my mind, if anyone here knows what the number one flow state activity is in the world, reported. And I invite people maybe to put it in the chat. It's not meditation, by the way. Dancing's really high up there. That's a great one as well. Anyone else any ideas? And surfing's definitely up there, but it's not the number one. Running, that's probably no, number two. Skydiving. I think the problem with skydiving as a flow state activity is that for a lot of people, it's amazing. And for a lot of people, it's way beyond their comfort level. So it's terror for some of them. Playing music, absolutely nearly up there. Jennifer, you are the one who's the closest so far. And the answer to that is actually great conversation with someone. Great conversation with someone who's inspiring to you. You're meeting them at usually an intellectual level. Maybe they're just a bit above you and you're rising to them. How do we know if we've been in flow with someone that you're having great conversation with? You go, oh my God, look at the time. I've got to go. I can't believe how fast that's gone. The time dilation that we were talking about earlier. So I wanted to bring that in there just to show you that like the skills challenge balance is at play with great conversation. if I'm talking about physics with Einstein, I'm not going to get in flow. I just do not have the skill set to talk about things with like certain, they get to certain levels. But you know what it's like when you're maybe at an ISTO conference or you're in areas of your work or you meet someone new at a dinner party or you're catching up with someone who you haven't seen for a long time and you get into that zone with them. And the immediate feedback in great conversation is this is going well. They're liking what I'm saying. I'm liking what they're saying. And we use words like riffing, don't we? We say we're bouncing off each other, but you know that you are adequate to the task of the conversation. You're getting that immediate feedback. So immediate feedback isn't necessarily just standing on a surfboard. It's just knowing that what is going on right now is going well and I'm adequate to that task. So far we've got clear goals, we've got the skills challenge balance, and we've got immediate feedback. I would say those are the top three most important flow triggers. And the fourth one is something that I wish I could talk to most surf instructors about because often their enthusiasm actually inhibits people getting into flow. And you'll see what I mean in just a second. It's non-interruption. When you start getting into flow, the worst thing to destroy flow states is being interrupted. And what do certain instructors do when they're really excited for someone and they're just, this is so great? They start shouting at the person to go left or keep your head up or bring your back foot round or whatever it is. Or they say things like, go, go, go. And the person's going for the wave. And then they suddenly, the whole concentration is interrupted. From my experience and from what I know, the best instruction comes just before the event. So, hey, Chris, this wave's for you. And then let Chris go for that wave. And then afterwards, you debrief it, you break it down. Because if you start shouting, if I start shouting at Chris, like, go right, get your head up, paddle harder, all these sorts of things, it interrupts that focus and flow, that focus that allows people to get into flow. So non-interruption is absolutely essential. And the best data for this comes from actually Google programmers. There was a lot of data that a lot of research that Google did, and particularly on kind of the flow states that programmers were getting into. Now that's probably all gone now with AI programming, but a few years ago, this is what was happening, is they found it took about 20 minutes for people to get back in after they've been interrupted. So setting up an environment where we encourage people to be able to get into flow, we set up the environment to create a challenge skills ratio that works for them. We set it up that there are goals. We set it up so they can get immediate feedback. Great. But then we have to let people go for it. And then usually I find, come to me, come to someone else and say, hey, what happened there? Oh yeah, maybe next time look into the horizon, or maybe next time angle your board a bit this way, or maybe, but to do that in the moment, it often, and it's often the feedback I get and I hear from people is that actually is the most stressful part for someone, is they're all really excited and then they're being sort of screamed at in the moment and they lose their ability to get in. So we've got clear goals, flow follows focus, goals create focus. We've got the challenge skills ratio, which allows us to set up and be in an environment that is conducive for us to get into flow. So yeah, don't take beginners out, as we all know, don't take beginners out to the barreling double overhead reef break when they're learning, because you're just going to set people back. Immediate feedback and non-interruption. Now, the non-interruption piece is really interesting for any of you who've run a business or been in a business. Open plan offices are an absolute disaster for productivity. They're good for sharing of information, but what if you find if you look at open plan offices now, everyone's got their headphones in and they've got headphones in so they're not being interrupted because there's nothing more irritating than trying to get going with something and everyone's tapping you on the shoulder either virtually or physically. So non-interruption in productivity in business is absolutely essential as well. And you'll find that good businesses now, if they do have more of an open plan environment, will have areas or units or cubicles or offices that people can book and allow themselves to have that time to really focus and hopefully get into some form of flow because they're not being interrupted. Now, there are some other interesting things to know about getting into flow. Um, Flow states tend to last about 90 minutes maximum to 120 minutes. Knowing that, you start to realize, well, that's what most sports are set up around. We love watching people and playing sports. A lot of sports are 80 to 90 minutes. Um, Flow states are very there's huge energy consumption when you get into flow. You burn through a lot of glucose and you also use up a lot of neurotransmitters, neuromodulators in the brain, so are engaged and used. So you do have to be aware that you want to be well rested and sleep well, and these sorts of things are very important. If I'm not getting into flow today, maybe I'm tired, maybe I've got my goals wrong, but they're knowing these things are really, really important. Erica, nice to see that in the chat, sir. I've just seen. As a Montessori educator, I totally agree. Non-interruption is so important. And the Montessori prepared environment that they talk about is outside of extreme sports, the number one flow activity, as in terms of the amount of time people get into, that's like an official activity, is Montessori education. And Erica, there's some great data around that I see you smiling. But if you know about Montessori education, it will all make total sense to you. Um, okay, so what I've done is, by the way, I put in the chat some information for you to do a deep dive. Now, all I'm doing today is scratching the surface of this and hopefully giving you some pointers and introducing you to some concepts, maybe clarifying some things about flow state. But I'm hoping you're starting to see like, okay, understanding flow state can help me be a better clinician. It can help me refine what I'm doing to help allow people to get into this place. Because the other thing about flow state that's really important, if you're thinking about this um, from a clinician's point of view, a psychological point of view, is I sometimes call it a state of forced mindfulness. It's a state where we create an environment where people can only think about what they're doing right now, the task at hand. And I know that this is comes up all the time in the qualitative data that people will say things like, I can't think of anything else when I'm out in the waves. I can't, and that I can't my anxieties go because, you know, I'm not thinking about the tax man. I'm not thinking about the argument I had with my wife. I'm not thinking about issues at work. I'm not thinking about how my children are. I'm totally at one because if I'm not focusing on the present, I'm going to get battered by that wave, or I'm going to, there are many other examples of how and why that would be. But we have to be in the present and being fully present or as present as possible. I think I think the brain loves that sometimes. I know that the psyche does, and I think that's a really important part of this as well, is that we're setting up an environment. And if you study flow states, if you look at a lot of the interviews with young skateboarders, they'll say for those 3 hours I'm skating in the skate park, I'm not worried about the bullies at school. I'm not worried about the assignments I have to do. I'm not worried about mum and dad fighting now. I'm able to just be fully present. And that in itself, aside from any of the other things I'm going to talk to you about with the flow cycle in a second, and those productivity gains, and those creativity gains, and those creativity, problem solving, productivity gains that I mentioned at the beginning, the Harvard study, the University of Sydney, DARPA's research, just that respite from the head from the future or the past. If we're talking about trauma, people are nearly always stuck, or part of them is stuck in the past. If we're talking about OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder, people are always fixated on the future. If we're talking about addiction, people are often riddled with shame about what they've done, or terrified about where they're going to be going in the future. They have 2 hours or 90 minutes of not being in that environment in their head. And that in itself is just, I think, one of the most important things about flow state, and how flow state is deeply therapeutic for people. But beyond that, I want to introduce you to now, which is in one of the PDFs, called something called the flow cycle. Now, you'll see that in one of the PDFs. Now, the most important thing to understand about the flow cycle, now, the flow cycle was first identified by someone called Herbert Benson and his research. But um, the flow cycle, if you understand the flow cycle, you can understand how to set up your work to be an optimal for getting into flow, and how we can use this therapeutically. Now, all flow state starts, and there's 4 distinct stages to the flow cycle. And before I even go into that, I have to let you know that it's non-negotiable. You cannot cheat any of these stages. And if you understand that, it makes it so much easier to be with and to teach people how to move through the flow cycle. The first stage, which is absolutely essential, is there has to be a sense of struggle. You have to have that anxiety that will develop the amount of focus for you to get into flow. Because flow follows focus, and that focus comes from the need to focus on something singular. And when you are anxious, that's what anxiety, all emotions are positive and adaptive. All the negative emotions that people want to run away from, they are adaptive. The purpose of anxiety is to get stuff done. The purpose of anxiety is to motivate you to change something so that that situation no longer exists. And what it does to the body is it makes you tense. It makes you shut out other things so that you're focused on what you need to do. And that could be paying your tax bill. It could be writing an awkward email, or it could be getting out there into those waves. Now, if you think about that with people who are often surfing for the first time or early in their career with that, that's really important to understand, that there needs to be a sense of anxiety, and normalizing that with our clients is absolutely essential. But the struggle phase, when you're in the struggle phase, you have your goal, and you can't be right outside of that skills challenge balance. If I'm too anxious, I wouldn't even start getting going. And if I'm not anxious enough, I'm not going to have the focus to get into flow. So I'll need to raise the challenge somehow. But the beginning of the flow cycle starts with struggle. And when you're in the struggle phase, you are dominated by beta brainwave states, which is kind of what most of you will probably be in now. It's the kind of engaged, rational mind where you're doing your day to day, you're focused. That's what beta is. And when you are in the struggle phase, you'll start to get flooded with cortisol, stress hormone, and you'll start to get flooded with norepinephrine. Now, norepinephrine is another name for noradrenaline. I don't know why, but for some reason in the brain it's called norepinephrine, in the rest of the body it's called noradrenaline, but we're talking about the same thing here. And and if you think, when I'm adrenalized and stressed, it makes me really try. The goal of that, the adaptive side of that, is to get me to focus. Now, knowing that I'm going to go through a struggle phase allows me to embrace struggle as opposed to reject it. Because what a lot of people try and do is they try and erase that struggle. The best way to erase the struggle, if you're writing an essay for school, the best way to erase the struggle is to go make yourself a coffee or a tea, or it's to check your Instagram and get a little dopamine hit. That then the problem with these activities is they keep resetting the flow cycle, so I'm never going to get into flow. So if I have some kind of mindful awareness that I'm in struggle, and that struggle is absolutely an essential part of the flow cycle, I can embrace it instead of rejecting it. And the more I know about it, the easier it is. So if I have some kind of mindful awareness, or even just, hey, it's just going to be it's going to be a little bit difficult to begin with, and that's okay. You're going to be a little bit anxious. It's going to be like, cool, because that we need to go through that to get into, um, to move through the flow cycle. And I have a very good friend of mine who used to be a professor at York University. And when I was talking about the flow cycle once, he was like, "Oh my God, I wrote my whole PhD in struggle." Because what I did is every 5, 10 minutes, I would go make a cup of tea. I'd check my emails. I'd check my phone. I kept resetting. I never allowed myself to get into the flow because I kept short-circuiting this cycle. I find it really easy to concretize the struggle phase for me, and a lot of people find this useful when I talk about when I go running. When I go running, the first usually 15 minutes is me in this battle with myself. I'm saying things to myself like, do you really need to run that far today? Uh, do I even need to run today? Oh, I don't really like running that much. It makes me tired. And I get into this kind of bargaining debate with myself. I'm struggling with the activity at hand. And then I catch myself and I go, okay, that's just part of what it is. Because I know about the cycle, it becomes a lot easier to manage. But the great thing about struggle, and that data from Google and the data from other people, is that struggle tends to last about 15 minutes. Now, if you understand that and know about that, it partially explains why it's a disaster for those of you who know that in sport, when people do too well at the beginning of what the sport is. So if you're playing soccer and you score a goal in the first 5 minutes, it's usually a disaster, and often you'll end up losing because the struggle is over and you take your foot off the gas. You want to keep that struggle to allow yourself to move through the flow cycle. Now, if you know that I have to stay in struggle and that the struggle time is usually limited as long as the challenge doesn't get higher and higher and higher, if the challenge stays the same, I have a chance of moving through that cycle and into getting into flow state. Now, before you get into flow state, which is stage 3 of the flow cycle, you'll move into what we call, I was about to say recovery, the release phase. And this is when it just starts to get a little bit easier. And I think a lot of you will probably recognize this. It's like, oh, that, like when I'm running, it's like I'm into the running now. And okay, I'm getting a pace now, and it's okay. I'm going. And the thoughts and the struggling thoughts and the challenge of myself seems to dissipate. And what you find, and as long as you're not interrupted, you will move through this release phase. And the release phase isn't that long, but I think a lot of you will recognize this, is when everything starts to become a little bit easier. Now, why does it start to become a little bit easier? Well, when you're moving through the release phase, one thing that's happening in the brain is you're getting more dominant alpha brainwave states. Now, alpha is an awake state, but it's not so alert. It's a little bit more dreamy. It's that kind of state when you've got up in the morning, you're brushing your teeth, you're definitely awake, but it's definitely not the alertness of being in the office. Alpha is a state that people often get into when they're doing light meditation. Then that's when maybe you're surfing and it's just starting to get a little bit more kind of, I'm getting a feel like I'm a little more in the zone here. But what else is happening, which is absolutely essential, is you start to release nitric oxide. And nitric oxide is a vasodilator. And what do you mean by that? It means it's opening up your blood vessels and it's allowing you to absorb more oxygen. You're becoming more efficient. And that's when, you're running or you're playing sport or you're surfing, it's the paddling. I find that my paddle strength and my paddling with surfing for the first 15 minutes or so is pretty bad, and I'm tired. I sometimes get worried that I'm not going to manage the session. And then I find these things start to get easier. That means I'm going through the release phase. And that's because of the nitric oxide. And it's one of the reasons that we should breathe through our nose and not through our mouth, is when we breathe through our nose, we release nitric oxide. And I'm a terrible mouth breather. I've had to buy the stuff to put on my mouth when I sleep. But when we breathe through our nose, even though we get in less air, we get more, the oxygen efficiency is much better because we release nitric oxide. Now, that vasodilation that's so important allows us to move into flow state. And when we move through the release and into flow, this is when the real magic happens. And what goes on when I'm in flow state? Well, I tell you what happens in the brain is you start getting much more theta and gamma brainwaves going on. Now, theta is the dominant brainwave state when we're dreaming. And I think people will often report being in flow state feels quite dreamy. It feels quite spiritual. It feels like I'm in slightly another dimension. I'm in another place. And that's got a lot to do with the theta and gamma waves that are firing away when you're in that state. It's incredibly creative. Think how mad your dreams are. Yeah, but when you've got a lot of theta going along, you are starting to make far more lateral connections. And this is why a lot of the enhanced problem solving and creativity comes in. But also, almost more importantly, is you start to become flooded with dopamine. Now, dopamine people talk about as a feel-good chemical, but actually, dopamine is the neuromodulator that is all about motivation. It makes you want to do more, keep going forward again. That's why when I catch that wave and I'm like, yes, I'm paddling out again, because that a lot of that has to do with the dopamine. But dopamine is absolutely essential for making connections. I often say that I often ask people, and I often use the examples of this in rehab. I've worked for many years in rehab, and I'll say to people, if you want to get the perfect drug hit, get into flow states. And they say, what do you mean? I said, well, you're releasing a ton of dopamine. That's just like being on cocaine, but without the side effects. And I often say to people, what do people do when they're on cocaine? And everyone goes, they chat all the time. I say, yeah, but what do they chat about? Making plans. When you're flooded with dopamine, you are talking and thinking about ideas of making plans, this, and it's all about pattern recognition. Oh, this can go with this and that can go with that. And when you're in flow, you're doing that all the time. You're noticing the little nuances in the waves and or on the skateboard or when you're painting or whatever it is, but you're starting to make all these connections. But not only that, you also start to release a huge amount of endorphins. And again, people will say endorphins, that's about feeling good, right? Well, actually, endorphin stands for endogenous morphine. And and before fentanyl came along, endogenous morphine was considered the strongest opiate that there is. It's a painkiller. The endorphins explains why at 6 or 8 in the evening you notice all these bruises on you that you didn't feel while you were in the state. It allows you to keep going. It allows you to keep running. The endorphins allow you to not notice you're tired. They allow you to push on through. They allow you to take that crunching tackle. They allow you the endorphins is why when the fin hits you, it doesn't hurt, but it hurts later on. And that allows you to remain in the state. And it allows, if you think about the triggers of the non-interruption, the pain is not interrupting you and allowing you to keep going. And then also, you also get a lot of anandamide released when you are in flow state. Now, anandamide, I was talking to a psychiatrist friend recently, and he said anandamide is one of the most common neurotransmitters in the brain, but no one ever talks about it. But anandamide is very similar is what THC bonds to. So it makes everything a little bit more sparkly, and enhances your hearing, your eyesight. And this is what people report when I'm in flow. When I'm really in the zone, everything just seems clearer, a little bit brighter. I can, and partially because of the anandamide. So to the people in rehab, I say you can get the best hit there is by being in flow state. And that partially explains why flow state feels so good. You're getting the dopamine, the anandamide, and the endorphins all at once. And if you're thinking about it in drug terms, you're getting it at the perfect dose with no side effects. And when I say that, if you want to motivate a group of addicts, recovering addicts, tell them that because you'll find a lot of people with addiction issues gravitating towards surf therapy. And so understanding that part of the flow state and the flow cycle and what's going on when you're in flow can be a nice thing to dangle to help people understand what's going on and allow them to maybe start doing activities that are much more, I think from what I've seen, much more beneficial for them and their families. So we've got flow, we got the third stage of the flow cycle, which is flow itself. Now that can only you can only really be in flow for about 90 minutes to 120 minutes. And I often find that I know I'm coming out of flow if I've been in flow, if I've managed to get into flow. When I start making mistakes, I start to lose my concentration. It's like, and if you've got a good mindfulness practice and you can be aware of that, that's the time to stop. Because that's a bit of a dangerous time when you come out of flow and into what we call the recovery phase. That's often when people injure themselves. I'm just going to do one more. I'm just going to try a bit more. And then you keep messing up and then you get cross with yourself and you're like, hold on, half an hour ago, I was completely in the zone. What's happening now? Why can't I? That's the time to stop. And teaching people that can be really beneficial if you're doing any kind of coaching. Now, what happens when you come out of flow state is there's a little bit of a crash, but it's a bit of a warm crash. And we move into something called the recovery phase. Now, the recovery stage is, I describe it, if you just want to use simple terms, that warm blanket feeling afterwards when you've been in the zone and it just feels really good afterwards and you're sitting down there with a blanket or whatever it is and it just feels really great. And the recovery phase is where you start to become more dominated by delta brain waves in the brain. And delta is what the dominant state, brainwave state when you're in deep sleep, but you also move into delta before you fall asleep. And my experience and millions of other people's experiences, often before fall asleep, I have a brilliant idea. And what do I say to myself about that brilliant idea? I'm definitely going to remember that in the morning. And then in the morning, I can't remember it for anything because I'm moving into sleep and I've forgotten it. But these great ideas come up, and a lot of eureka moments come from coming out of flow state. Now, Nietzsche used to say the best ideas came after a long walk. Now, a long walk for Nietzsche, he grew up in the Alps. A long walk for Nietzsche is basically a hike through the mountains. He's talking about flow state. And he's coming out and he's saying the best ideas will come then. And a lot of people report that I have these amazing ideas pop in after I've done some kind of intense activity. Now, the reason for that is actually the loading that happened in flow state, the dopamine, the theta brainwaves, all that productivity and creativity that's going on comes to the surface when you stop and you slow down. And when you are in that recovery phase, that warm blanket phase, that kind of sleepy, dreamy state that I don't know if any of you do yoga nidra or non-sleep deep rest, but that gets you into a very similar state. The kids in rehab used to call it heroin yoga because they felt so blissed out from being in that delta state. It makes you very calm and it makes even more lateral connections. So you're saying this and allows ideas to come up. But also what's happening in the brain is you have a real increase in serotonin and oxytocin. Now, what does oxytocin do? Oxytocin is the bonding hormone, but it's also the trust hormone. And what does serotonin do? Well, serotonin makes you feel very connected to people. It's kind of the love bonding neuromodulator. And serotonin makes you still. It calms you down. So when you're in that recovery phase, and you will notice this with your clients if you're taking them out surfing or doing similar activities, is the afterwards is where all this bonding seems to take place. You were so great out there, and I was so proud of what you did, and oh, I wanted to cry, and then it brought up all these feelings that I've never told anyone before, and you probably all witnessed a lot of this. This is the prime time to do therapeutic work. People are trusting and they're creative and they're open. And this is why we always do the therapeutic work, the interventions afterwards, in our work at Resurface. But and I know a lot of other people do. But that is the prime time and place we see that people and our qualitative feedback. So many people say, "Oh, I went so much deeper, so much faster when we came back from the surfing. I've never we did in this week what took months in rehab." That these are the sort of quotes that people are saying, and the science shows that it's. I hypothesize, and I know it to be true, and is that a lot of that comes from the oxytocin, the serotonin, the delta waves, the experience you've been through, and creating an environment to allow people to make the most of that is where a lot of these productivity, creativity, and problem solving that's reported in those studies is allowed to come through because a lot of therapeutic healing comes from people who weren't able to make connections that they can now make themselves before. You know how you sit there and you think it's so obvious to me what's going on or what's up with this person, but they can't connect to it themselves. And one of the main reasons there I could go talk about this for hours, so forgive me, but like one of the main issues with PTSD, for example, is something called hypofrontality, where the prefrontal cortex switches off. It really dims down, and that stops for people from being able to access and make decisions and make connections. And what we're doing with this work is we're helping people reactivate those parts of their brain, but not from like talking to them and forcing them, from just doing an activity, from being embodied from things like surfing. Now, this knowing this cycle allows you to set up your programs to make the most of all of these productivity gains. Now, I've been in flow a bit, and sorry, I've been talking really fast and so much, and I've just seen the time. I've lost sense of time. So I want to allow people to ask questions and so on. If people want to, I'm very happy to go over. I don't know if other people are, but I'm very happy to answer a few questions to go over. But what I'm really hoping is that I've piqued your interest. I've hopefully allowed some of you to put words to some of the things you've observed, or maybe help you. You might think, oh, I can bring that into my work, whatever it is. But I really, so I hope that was valuable for you. But what I also would like to know is if anybody has any specific questions, or Chris, if you've got some questions that I can answer here. Um, I
Yeah,
always find
go
the
ahead.
Q&A session is where I get the most into flow when I'm public speaking. And the reason for that is I know my material, but I don't know what the questions are. So it heightens, it makes it harder for me. If you think about that skills challenge balance, I'm like ready and I love the Q&A. What I'll also do is I'll share with you our latest data. I'll put it in the chat. Using the ISTO framework, evaluation framework, to show you some of the extraordinary therapeutic gains we're getting from that you all know about and witness in your projects, but hopefully understanding the flow cycle and what flow is helps explain why we're getting these huge breakthroughs. But yeah, over to you, Chris, and the rest of you if you have any specific questions.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Josh, that was incredible. I hate to interrupt because we want to also respect everybody's time. We have like 4 minutes. There is a question on here, Isabel. If you want to come off um sound, I'm happy to let you ask the question. I got so much out of this job. I cannot tell you that whole idea of when you're aware that struggle is part of the flow cycle. Now you can wrap your arms around it and embrace it. I just love that. I'm going to quote that and put that on social. So Isabel is not coming up. So I'm just going to ask Isabel's questions. She said earlier, doesn't setting a clear goal also put pressure on the person to achieve it and make it harder to get into flow or be in flow?
Yeah, but it's all about we need to set up the conditions for this is where really good facilitation comes in. So, and this is why the collaborative nature of a clinician in a group and stuff is really important because you part of your job is to help people set a realistic goal, a goal that's appropriate to them, and also some psychoeducation about what happens when you achieve goals, but also some psychoeducation about, well, maybe we got the goal slightly wrong, and tomorrow we're gonna alter that goal. But you do need, it's like, yes, that's true, but that's just part of it. It's not a bug. It's just part of the system that we partly need the goal to create the focus. So your clinical skills need to come into play of helping people identify the right goals and manage those goals. It's a great question though.
Super powerful, Josh. So Marika is asking the maximum time frame for like flow state, which I think you'd said 90 to 120 minutes, which Helen just wrote. I also had written that down. Yeah, Marika, it's about 90 to 120 minutes. That was the other part. Oh man, my mind blown, the whole skills challenge balance. I kept thinking, how come I don't get in the flow every time I surf? Well, it's 1 foot sloppy wind swell waves, and I'm not being challenged. I learned so much.
Yeah.
Anyway, okay, we've got a couple minutes. Any other? Oh, let's see.
I'll say one thing about the 90 to 120 minutes.
Yeah,
People who are really, really dedicated in their training and the top athletes will often set themselves up, particularly in training, to get into 90 to 120 minutes flow, say early in the morning. The people who get up at 4 in the morning and they're doing their thing, because they can often manage themselves to get about another half an hour to an hour later on, right at the end of the day. That's if you're really good and you know exactly what you're doing. But in general, think about 90 to 120 minutes. This is partly why so many people come out the water after about 90 to 120 minutes.
that's right. Do you see Helen's last part of that question? She said, but
Uh,
how long do you aim for the flow cycle to last before starting trauma processing talk therapy aspect?
oh, that's a great question.
Great
Well, I
question.
mean, I mean, the great thing about the work we're doing, particularly if you're on the beach stuff, is immediately. You can start. There's a context. So, as an EMDR clinician, we're not going to start EMDR processing on the beach, but we're going to talk about resourcing. We're going to reflect on what's come up. We're going to ask people, what did you notice? We're going to start to like invite people to journal, even if it's just journaling in their minds. Even just asking, how was that? Is part of the process. But yeah, you're not going to do something formal straight away, but you can be doing something formal within half an hour. Definitely.
That's incredible. All right. Well, Josh, it's 10 o'clock. We're on the hour. Everybody, if you could just throw some love to Josh in the chat. Cannot say thank you enough for this. ISTO web series, we need to do more of them. We are going to do more of them. Our next one is in July. And we are going to continue to do more of these. The ISTO conference, it's been announced, is online this year, October 1st and 2nd. We will have registration opening up in the next month. But it's so great to see you, Josh. I took copious notes. Everybody, I will be emailing you the PDFs as soon as this is over. When you go and look at those, if you didn't get a chance to while Josh was speaking, it's fascinating. It feels like the exact tools and resources that we need to not just practice in our surf therapy, of course, organizations, but even within ourselves. So, Josh, thanks so much for being here, and all of you. Afternoon, evening, miss you. Thank you for joining this amazing, amazing webinar. Josh, you're the
Lovely
best.
to see you all.
Thanks, everybody. Have a great day.
Take care. Bye now.
Yes, recordings available, Marika. Recordings going out too. Thanks, everyone. Bye. Great job.